A man walks home in silence. He does not carry a spear. He does not wear armor. He is unarmed, barefoot, moving carefully through the dark fields beyond the city. He knows these paths. He has worked them since childhood. He knows which stones cut the skin, which ditches flood after rain. He also knows he might not survive the night. Somewhere behind him, young men are moving too. Trained men, citizens. They do not announce themselves. They are not at war with a foreign enemy. This is not battle. This is ritual. If they find him, there will be no trial, no accusation spoken aloud. His death will be counted as necessary. This is life under Sparta. Not the Sparta of banners and last stands, not the Sparta carved into legend. This is Sparta as it existed most days, quiet, watchful, afraid. Because Sparta was never afraid of invasion first. It was afraid of its own people. This is the story of how fear, constant, intimate fear, shaped one of history's most brutal military systems. This is the story of a ruling minority that built an army not to conquer the world, but to survive the night. If you find this kind of history worth exploring, take a moment to like, subscribe, and comment, not to celebrate the violence, but to keep these stories alive and examined. Sparta liked to present itself as stable, eternal, unchanging, a society of iron discipline and perfect order. But beneath that image was a simple, unbearable fact. Most of the people living under Spartan control were not Spartans. They were helots, an enslaved population tied to the land, forced to feed the citizen body, denied freedom, denied weapons, denied dignity. They outnumbered their masters by a wide margin. Ancient estimates vary, but the imbalance was never in doubt. In some regions, helots may have outnumbered Spartan citizens 7-1. Every Spartan child grew up knowing this. Every adult lived with it. The fields that fed the city were worked by people who hated it. The roads were walked by people with reason to remember every cruelty. The houses were built atop a labor system that could turn violent at any moment. And it had before. Sparta's early history was marked by revolt. The most dangerous enemy was not across a border, but underfoot. A single coordinated uprising could overwhelm the citizen body. A single failed harvest, a single rumor of weakness, could turn fear into bloodshed. So Sparta did not gamble on goodwill. It chose control. That choice shaped everything. Sparta's famous discipline did not begin as a quest for excellence. It began as a response to terror, the fear that if vigilance slipped, even briefly, the city would burn from within. This is why the Spartan state did not merely train soldiers, it engineered citizens. From early childhood, boys were removed from their families and placed into the agoge. Hunger was deliberate, hardship was calculated, obedience was absolute. The goal was not battlefield brilliance alone. It was the production of men who would not hesitate to kill when ordered, and would not question why. The enemy they were being prepared to face lived next door. Spartan society became a permanent garrison. Meals were eaten in common messes, privacy was discouraged, movement was monitored, even speech was controlled, brief, clipped, leaving little room for dissent or reflection. Silence was safety. Above all, fear was kept alive. Each year, the Spartan state formally declared war on the helot population, not because it expected open battle, but because it legalized murder. Young men were sent out at night in secret operations, what later sources describe as the cryptire. They killed those who looked strong, those who looked proud, those who looked capable of leading others. The message was never subtle. You are watched. You are vulnerable. You live because we allow it. But the system cut both ways. Spartans trained themselves to see threat everywhere, not just in the enslaved, but in deviation. Wealth differences among citizens were discouraged. Individual ambition was suspect. Change itself became dangerous. A society built on fear cannot relax without risk. Over time, the pressure intensified. The citizen body shrank, land concentrated. Fewer men qualified for full citizenship. Fewer could contribute to the communal system that sustained the army. Every loss mattered more. Every death thinned an already narrow line. And still the helots remained, working, watching, waiting. Sparta responded not by easing control, but by tightening it. The answer to fear was always more discipline, more ritual, more violence, more inward focus. The war machine turned further inward. This is the pressure that defines Sparta at its height. A city that appears unbreakable from the outside, but lives with the constant knowledge that its foundations rest on people who would gladly tear it down. And that knowledge never leaves. It shapes how children are raised, how leaders decide, how soldiers think about mercy, how an entire society defines strength, not as growth or adaptability, but as the ability to endure permanent suspicion. By the time Sparta stands ready to face its enemies abroad, it has already been at war for generations, not against rivals, but against the fear that one night the silence will break. Fear sharpens when numbers no longer favour you. For Sparta, that moment did not arrive suddenly. It crept in, generation by generation, as the citizen body thinned and the world beneath it stayed the same. The fields still needed tending. The harvest still came from the same hands. The enslaved population remained vast, rooted to the land, watching a ruling class grow smaller and more brittle. This imbalance was not abstract. It shaped daily life. A Spartan citizen did not wake up wondering if the helots were unhappy. That was assumed. The question was whether they were organizing, whether tonight would be quiet, whether this year's harvest would bring hunger close enough to courage. The state responded by tightening every screw it could reach. Citizens were discouraged from trade. Foreign travel was restricted. Coinage was controlled. Even wealth was treated as a threat, not because Sparta valued equality, but because disparity invited resentment and fracture within the ruling class itself. Unity among citizens was survival. Division was an opening. Meals were taken in common messes, the syssitia. Attendance was mandatory. Contribution was required. A man who could no longer afford to participate did not merely lose status. He lost citizenship. He slipped toward the edge of society. Another body no longer counted among the defenders. The result was a vicious arithmetic. Fewer citizens meant fewer contributors. Fewer contributors meant more exclusion. More exclusion meant fewer citizens still. All the while, the helots remained. They worked the same land. They paid fixed portions of their harvest. They endured ritualized humiliation, forced drunkenness at festivals, public beatings, reminders of their place. These acts were not excess. They were policy. Fear was cultivated carefully, like a crop. But fear is never one-directional. The more Sparta relied on intimidation, the more it revealed its dependence. Helots were forbidden weapons, yet they labored near tools every day. They were denied military training, yet they watched Spartan drill constantly. They learned the rhythms. They learned when patrols were light. They learned which masters were cruel and which were merely afraid. Spartan leaders knew this. They also knew that repression alone could not solve a demographic problem. An army cannot be everywhere at once. Surveillance has limits. Terror dulls with repetition. And the citizen body, small, insular, trained only for war, was not easily replenished. Marriage was regulated. Childbearing was encouraged not for family continuity, but for state survival. Boys were inspected at birth. Weakness was not tolerated because every future citizen mattered. This pressure fell hardest on the young. From early adolescence, Spartan boys were pushed into a world where scarcity was intentional. Hunger taught theft. Theft taught stealth. Punishment taught endurance. The lesson was never subtle. Survival depended on obedience, and mercy was dangerous. Yet even as the state hardened its youth, cracks widened elsewhere. Older citizens began to die faster than they could be replaced. Land passed into fewer hands. The ideal of equal warrior citizens became harder to maintain. Sparta spoke constantly of tradition, but it was already adapting. Quietly, defensively, without admitting the danger. One such adaptation was reliance. When foreign wars demanded manpower, helots were sometimes armed and sent alongside citizens. Not as equals, never that, but as necessity. Each time this happened, it carried risk. A man trained to fight does not easily forget it. A man who tastes autonomy does not easily return to submission. The state rewarded some with promises of freedom. Others were released in name only. Many were quietly eliminated afterward. Accounts suggest celebrations followed by disappearances, generosity followed by silence. These were not contradictions in Spartan policy. They were symptoms. Sparta was trying to solve an impossible equation, maintain absolute control over a majority population with a shrinking minority, using a system that allowed no flexibility. Every solution generated new dangers. Every concession threatened precedent. Every act of violence required repetition to remain effective, and beneath it all was the knowledge that if control ever slipped, if discipline faltered, if fear weakened, if citizens hesitated, the consequences would be immediate and unforgiving. This anxiety seeped upward. Leadership positions became conservative by necessity. Innovation looked like risk. Diplomacy looked like exposure. Even victory abroad was double-edged. Absent armies invited unrest at home. Campaigns were shortened. Wars were fought with one eye always turned inward. Sparta became cautious not because it lacked strength, but because it could not afford distraction. The ruling elite understood this even when they did not say it aloud. Their power rested on a foundation that required constant pressure. Let up, and the structure might collapse. Apply too much, and it might shatter anyway. So the city lived in balance, held together by ritual, surveillance, and controlled brutality. But balance is not stability. It is tension, sustained. And as the generations passed, that tension did not ease. It compounded, pressed by numbers, by fear, by a system that demanded perfection from fewer and fewer men, while standing on the labor of many who waited for weakness. Sparta did not yet break, but it was no longer simply strong, it was strained. Decay in Sparta did not announce itself with collapse, it appeared as contradiction. The city spoke endlessly of equality among citizens, yet wealth pooled quietly in fewer hands. It praised obedience, yet depended on fear to enforce it. It celebrated stability, yet required constant violence to maintain it. These tensions did not tear Sparta apart immediately. They settled in, normalized, defended as tradition. But they changed how power worked. At the top of Spartan society sat a system designed to prevent any single point of failure. 2 kings, not one. A council of elders, the Gerousia, to temper rash decisions. Overseers, ephors, elected annually, empowered to restrain even kings if necessary. In theory, it was balanced. In practice, it was suspicious. Every institution existed to watch another. Authority was fragmented not out of trust, but fear. Fear that concentrated power would invite tyranny, and tyranny would invite revolt. The state feared not just the enslaved population, but itself. This bred caution and hesitation. Strategic decisions slowed. Military innovation stalled. Commanders were constrained by the knowledge that failure could be punished not merely as incompetence, but as betrayal. Victories were celebrated carefully. Losses were scrutinized mercilessly. The system discouraged risk, even when risk was necessary. At the same time, the ideal Spartan citizen, the equal warrior sustained by communal land and shared discipline, was fading. Property laws, inheritance patterns, and simple mortality reduced the number of full citizens year by year. Those excluded did not vanish. They remained inside Spartan territory, neither helot nor citizen, suspended in resentment. The state had no language for them. Sparta knew how to rule masters and slaves. It did not know how to manage the in-between. This created quiet fractures. Men trained from childhood to believe they were the core of society found themselves stripped of status for failing to meet rigid requirements. They had discipline, they had military skill. What they lacked was place, and people without place are dangerous. To compensate, Sparta leaned harder on ritual. Old laws were repeated more often. Customs were enforced more strictly. The past was invoked as proof that the present was sustainable. Change was framed not as adaptation, but as betrayal of ancestral wisdom. Yet the world around Sparta was changing. Other Greek cities experimented with commerce, with diplomacy, with broader definitions of citizenship. They fielded larger armies, more flexible forces. Sparta watched them with suspicion, sometimes contempt, sometimes unease. Its own system allowed little adjustment. Even foreign policy reflected this rigidity. Alliances were chosen not for opportunity but for predictability. Expansion was limited. Prolonged campaigns were avoided. A Spartan army too long abroad meant fewer eyes at home. Every departure was a calculated risk. Meanwhile, the helots remained the constant variable. They bore the weight of the system's contradictions. They were essential and expendable at the same time. Fed just enough to work, punished enough to fear, watched enough to stay quiet, most of the time. But silence is not loyalty. Small acts of resistance persisted, slowed labour, sabotage, flight when possible, and always the threat of coordination. A single rumour of uprising could trigger harsh reprisals. Fear did not need confirmation to act. These responses reinforced the cycle. Violence justified fear. Fear justified control. Control required violence. Within the citizen body, this logic hardened attitudes. Compassion became liability. Doubt became weakness. A Spartan learned early that survival depended on conformity, not only in action, but in thought. This did not produce harmony. It produced uniformity under strain. Leadership disputes grew sharper beneath the surface. The dual kingship, meant to prevent autocracy, sometimes paralyzed command. The F4s, guardians of law, could become instruments of faction. Decisions were less about what was best and more about what was safest. Safety in Sparta meant preventing upheaval at almost any cost. The contradiction was stark. A society that trained relentlessly for war had limited tolerance for the uncertainty that real war brought. Its greatest fear was not defeat by an external enemy, but the destabilization that defeat, or even victory, might cause internally. This is the deeper decay, not weakness but inflexibility. Sparta's institutions had been shaped to solve one problem: control an outnumbered ruling class over a hostile population. They did this effectively for centuries, but in doing so, they narrowed the range of possible futures. Every generation inherited the same fear, intensified by fewer numbers and higher stakes. Every solution made the system more brittle. Every attempt to preserve the old order increased dependence on it. Sparta still stood strong in appearance. Its discipline remained legendary, its soldiers feared, its enemies cautious. But beneath the surface, the city was no longer adapting to fear. It was trapped by it. The reversal did not come from rebellion. It came from necessity. For generations, Sparta had believed that fear, discipline, and isolation could hold the system together indefinitely. That if pressure was maintained, if rituals were observed, if violence remained precise and controlled, the balance would hold. But reality intruded, not as ideology, not as debate, but as force. War demanded bodies. External threats grew harder to ignore. Alliances pulled Sparta into wider conflicts. The city could not simply refuse to fight beyond its borders forever. Each campaign stripped manpower from home, exposing the vulnerability everyone already understood, but rarely acknowledged aloud. The fear sharpened. For the first time, the problem was no longer theoretical. The citizen body could not meet the demands placed upon it. The army that defined Sparta was too small to function as it always had. So the state did something unthinkable. It adapted. Helots were armed. Not openly at first, not proudly, but carefully, under supervision, framed as temporary necessity rather than permanent change. Men who had lived their entire lives under surveillance were suddenly issued shields, spears, training. They marched beside citizens, not as equals, but close enough to see everything. This was the midpoint fracture, because once fear teaches a population how power works, it cannot unteach the lesson. Spartan leaders tried to control the consequences. They promised freedom to some. They rewarded loyalty selectively. They made examples, both positive and lethal. Accounts suggest that after certain campaigns, helots who had distinguished themselves were gathered, celebrated, and then quietly eliminated. Gratitude followed by terror. Hope followed by silence. The message was clear. Service does not erase fear, but the damage was done. Military necessity had exposed the lie at the heart of the system, that strength could be monopolized forever. Once weapons were distributed, even briefly, the psychological barrier cracked. The enslaved had proven capable of discipline, coordination, and courage under fire. The state had always claimed otherwise. At the same time, citizen soldiers began to see the contradiction up close. They depended on men they were taught to despise. They fought alongside those they were ordered to terrorize at home. The line between master and threat blurred, then reasserted itself violently. This oscillation bred instability. Sparta attempted reforms without naming them as such. Land redistribution was discussed, then resisted. Citizenship rules were bent in limited cases, then snapped back. New categories emerged: freed helots without full rights, armed auxiliaries without political voice. Each adaptation created another class the system had not been designed to manage, and fear returned stronger, because every exception became precedent. Every deviation suggested weakness. Every solution implied that the old order was no longer sufficient on its own. The ruling elite responded predictably. Oversight increased, punishments grew harsher, surveillance deepened. The ideology of discipline was reaffirmed with greater intensity, as if repetition alone could restore certainty. But repetition does not repair contradiction. Foreign victories no longer brought confidence. They brought questions. If helots could fight effectively abroad, why were they treated as permanent enemies at home? If citizens relied on them in war, what did that say about the system's foundations? These were not questions voiced publicly. They did not need to be. Fear communicated them well enough. The army, once a symbol of unity, became a reminder of dependency. Campaigns stretched longer, losses hurt more. Each fallen citizen represented not just a death, but a narrowing future. Sparta's leadership sensed the shift even as it denied it. Their adaptations were reactive, not strategic. They treated symptoms without addressing cause. The goal was always the same: preserve control, avoid revolt, survive the next crisis. But survival required compromise, and compromise eroded the very rigidity that had once defined Spartan power. The war machine, built to face inward, had been forced outward, and in doing so, it had revealed its limits. What had once been a closed system was now leaking. Authority, once absolute, was now conditional. Fear, once carefully managed, now spread unpredictably. Sparta had crossed a line it could not uncross, not into reform, but into uncertainty. And the city that had lived for centuries preparing for rebellion now faced a more dangerous question. What happens when the tools built to prevent collapse begin to expose it instead? Escalation in Sparta never arrived with speeches or decrees. It arrived quietly, as practice. Once the boundary had been crossed, once helots had been armed, rewarded, discarded, the ruling class no longer believed fear could be maintained by tradition alone. The system had already bent. Now it needed reinforcement. Violence became more routine. The night patrols grew bolder. Young citizens were sent out earlier, given wider latitude, fewer constraints. The cryptire, once framed as a test of endurance and stealth, hardened into something more openly punitive. Its targets were no longer chosen only for strength or leadership potential, but for symbolism: a man known to speak boldly, a family known to gather others, a village that had grown too confident. The goal was not just removal, it was demonstration. Bodies left where they would be found. Disappearances that were clearly understood. Violence that did not need explanation. The state wanted fear to travel faster than rumour, to arrive before resistance could form. For the helots, life narrowed. Work continued as always: fields, harvests, tribute, but now under sharper scrutiny. Any sign of organization could be fatal. Any unusual gathering risked accusation. Silence became survival, but silence also isolated. Trust eroded between neighbors. Fear fragmented communities that might otherwise have resisted together. This was not accidental. A divided population is easier to manage, but fear does not respect hierarchy. As repression intensified, it began to affect citizens as well. Participation in violence was no longer optional. To refuse was to invite suspicion. To hesitate was to mark oneself as unreliable. Young men learned that loyalty was proven not by words, but by acts they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. Some endured, others hardened. A few broke inwardly, carrying obedience like a wound that never closed. The human cost accumulated quietly. There were no memorials, no acknowledgement. Loss was absorbed into routine. A helot killed was not mourned publicly. A citizen brutalized by what he had done was expected to remain silent. Sparta did not recognize trauma as a category. It recognized only discipline or failure. The ruling elite told themselves this escalation was temporary, that pressure applied now would prevent catastrophe later. That cruelty was a form of care for the state, but escalation has momentum of its own. Once normalized, it demands repetition. Fear fades unless renewed, so punishments grew harsher. Collective reprisals replaced targeted ones. Villages suspected of disloyalty faced sweeping terror. Rewards for informants increased. Surveillance became social. Neighbors watching neighbors, citizens watching citizens, fear turning inward. The system began consuming trust. At the same time, military demands did not lessen. External threats persisted. Campaigns continued to pull men away from home. Each absence deepened anxiety. Each return brought stories of reliance on helot labor and helot arms, reigniting the same unresolved contradictions. The state responded by doubling down. More training, more ritual, more emphasis on obedience as virtue. The idea that Sparta was unique, superior, and eternally threatened became central to identity. To question methods was to question survival itself. This ideology was powerful. It justified almost anything, yet beneath it, exhaustion spread. The citizen body was still shrinking. Losses could not be replaced easily. The pressure on those who remained intensified. Every man carried more responsibility, more suspicion, more fear of being the weak link that triggered disaster. Sparta was no longer merely preventing revolt. It was living inside the expectation of it. The enslaved population sensed this shift. Rebellion did not need to happen to exert influence. The mere possibility shaped policy, behavior, and violence. Fear of uprising became a constant background presence, guiding decisions large and small. This is the paradox of escalation. The harsher the control, the more fragile the controller becomes. Every act of brutality confirms the fear that made it necessary. Every measure taken to suppress revolt reinforces the belief that revolt is inevitable. Sparta had not lost control, but it was paying more to maintain it, in blood, in trust, in the quiet erosion of the very discipline it claimed to perfect. And with each passing generation, the question grew harder to ignore, not whether rebellion would come, but how long a society could survive by treating fear itself as its most important weapon. Exhaustion does not look like collapse. It looks like continuity strained past endurance. By this stage, Sparta was still functioning. The laws stood. The rituals continued. The army marched when ordered. To outsiders, the city remained formidable, disciplined, austere, feared. But internally, the system was burning through its reserves. The citizen body had become dangerously thin. Losses in war, demographic decline, and rigid definitions of citizenship meant that fewer men carried more weight. Each Spartan citizen now represented not just himself, but a structural necessity. Every illness mattered. Every death narrowed the margin for error. The system responded as it always had, by demanding more. Training intensified. Expectations hardened. Boys were pushed harder, earlier, with less tolerance for failure. The state needed them to become men quickly, flawlessly, because there were not enough of them to absorb weakness. But pressure does not produce uniform results. Some adapted, others did not. Those who fell short were quietly removed from the citizen class, swelling the ranks of the disaffected, men who had been shaped by Spartan discipline but denied its rewards. They knew how the system worked. They knew where its seams lay. Sparta had created another problem it could not openly acknowledge. At the same time, control over the helot population required constant attention. Surveillance had become habitual, violence routine. The machinery of repression needed steady input, men, time, coordination. But these resources were increasingly scarce. The state faced a contradiction it could not resolve. To maintain internal security, it needed citizens at home. To maintain external security, it needed citizens abroad. It could not fully satisfy both. Campaigns became shorter, more cautious. Armies returned quickly, sometimes before objectives were fully secured. Victories were measured not only by enemy losses, but by how little disruption they caused at home. Fear dictated strategy. This constraint affected morale. Soldiers understood that their city could not afford decisive failure, but also could not fully exploit success. The war machine was powerful, but tethered. It could strike, but not roam. It could intimidate, but not transform the balance of power decisively. The world noticed. Rival states tested boundaries. Allies questioned reliability. Sparta's reputation still carried weight, but its responses grew predictable. Predictability is dangerous in war. Inside the city, trust continued to erode. Surveillance among citizens intensified subtly. Political accusations became more frequent. Loyalty was constantly measured, never assumed. The fear once focused outward and downward toward the enslaved now seeped sideways and up. Even leadership felt it. Commanders hesitated. Kings were constrained not just by law but by suspicion. Success brought scrutiny. Failure brought punishment. The margin for independent judgment narrowed, replaced by rigid adherence to precedent. The system preferred mistakes it recognized to innovations it could not control. This rigidity fed exhaustion. Sparta was no longer adapting to new pressures. It was compensating, patching weaknesses with familiar tools, even when those tools were losing effectiveness. More discipline, more fear, more insistence that nothing fundamental had changed, but everyone could feel it had. The helots, still bound to the land, still watched closely, sensed opportunity not in action, but in endurance. Time was on their side. The system relied on constant vigilance. They relied on patience. Every year that passed without collapse did not erase tension. It accumulated it. And the citizens felt this too. They lived with the knowledge that their society could not relax. Not for a season, not for a generation. The cost of vigilance was lifelong, and it was rising. This is what nearing exhaustion looks like. Not chaos, not rebellion, but a society locked into patterns it can no longer afford, yet cannot abandon. Sparta still stood. Its shields were still polished, its formations still drilled, its laws still spoken aloud with reverence. But beneath the surface, the system was running hot, sustained by fear, deprived of flexibility, and increasingly unable to imagine a future that did not look exactly like its past. And that made the final test inevitable. Not because Sparta was weak, but because it was tired. The end did not come as rebellion, it came as exposure. When Sparta finally faced a decisive external challenge, it did so with a system already stretched thin, by fear, by vigilance, by the constant inward pull of control. The army still marched with discipline. The formations still held their shape, but the assumptions beneath them were brittle. In 371 BCE, on open ground near Leuctra, Sparta met an enemy that did not fear its reputation. The Thebans advanced differently. Their formation was unconventional. Their intent was not to avoid the Spartan elite, but to strike it directly. Led by Epaminondas, they concentrated force where Sparta had always relied on moral dominance and tradition to hold the line. The result was not just a defeat, it was a rupture. Spartan citizens, irreplaceable, already too few, fell in numbers the state could not absorb. The myth of invincibility cracked in full view of Greece, and with it went the psychological weapon that had supported Spartan control for generations. Fear had always worked best when it was unquestioned. Now it was questioned everywhere. The aftermath spread quickly. Allies reconsidered their loyalty. Rivals pressed advantages long denied to them. Most dangerously, the internal balance Sparta had guarded so obsessively began to shift. Helot revolts did not erupt everywhere at once, but the pressure released. The old terror lost some of its force. Communities long suppressed seized opportunity where they could. Control that had required constant renewal now demanded more than the state could supply. Sparta tried to respond as it always had. It tightened discipline. It reaffirmed tradition. It punished deviation. But the tools were worn down. The citizen body could not be replenished fast enough. Fear, once carefully rationed, now felt desperate, and desperation does not command obedience. The city did not fall in flames. There was no single night of reckoning. What followed was something slower and more devastating. Irrelevance. Sparta remained. Its institutions lingered. Its customs were preserved in memory and ritual. But its power, rooted in a system designed to suppress revolt rather than adapt to change, had reached its limit. The war machine aimed inward had succeeded too well. By structuring every aspect of society around fear of collapse, Sparta ensured that collapse, when it came, would find no flexibility to resist it. The same rigidity that kept the helots down kept the city locked in place. The same suspicion that prevented rebellion prevented renewal. This is the final irony. Sparta did not fail because it lacked discipline. It did not fall because it grew soft. It did not lose because it forgot how to fight. It failed because it never learned how to stop being afraid. A society that treats fear as its primary instrument must keep sharpening it. But fear is a weapon that cuts both ways. Over time, it erodes trust, narrows imagination, and turns strength into habit rather than choice. Sparta built one of the most disciplined military cultures the world has ever known, and aimed it inward for so long that, when the moment came to face the future, there was nothing left to turn outward at all. The silence that followed was not peace. It was the sound of a system finally running out of enemies, except itself.